Well, welcome back to our Tuesday session with Dr. Jim deMaine called Ask the Doctor. We are experiencing some beautiful weather across the country right now. And so those of you who are tuning in on what is a sunny Tuesday in many parts of the country, we deeply appreciate you. And for those of you who are watching this as a recording, thanks for tuning in. All of these sessions are going to be recorded and available on EOL. So without further ado, pleased to once again honor my friend and bring him to the front of the stage. We're going to talk about advocates, health proxies. Welcome back, Jim.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for everybody giving up a little bit of time on such a beautiful day. I wish I could see you all and we could interact more directly, but this is the best we can do given geographic distribution and still the remnants of the COVID problem we've had over the whole country and world. As Michael mentioned, today I'd like to tell you a story, or at least a couple of stories about the issues of being a healthcare advocate. And we talk about advocate or health proxy or the legal term, durable power of attorney for healthcare. But the real issue is who can speak for you when you can't speak for yourself. This is the person when you are unable that will be talking to your healthcare providers, your family, and others about what your healthcare wishes would be. So it's a very important role. It's a difficult role, and one that certainly can't be gotten into lightly. But if we have a spouse or we're a child and have a parent, or even parent of a child, often we are kind of thrust into that role. Excuse me. So I'd like to read you a story from my book. It's several stories about advocacy and the difficult role that a healthcare proxy can be put into. But this particular episode is called Sailing to Hawaii. I never really understood tobacco addiction, how it seems to become part of you as it captures your soul. I once had a colleague, Steve, who was a beloved chief of our OBGYN service in the hospital where I worked, and unfortunately a 2-pack-a-day smoker. He knew it was probably killing him, and he was also an avid sailor, so he tried to trick himself into quitting. Jim, I'm going to kick the habit this time, he told me. I'm sailing to Hawaii and back without cigarettes. I didn't believe he could do it. He used to smoke in his office with his door shut, in violation of our clinic's no smoking policy, until we set up temporary smoking room. Sometimes during a lengthy surgery, he'd actually have to leave halfway through to have a smoke. Yet when Steve sailed off to Hawaii with his wife, Dorothy, he quit. He didn't smoke for 2 months. But on his return, it was as if Steve had never stopped at all. He said he couldn't feel normal without his nicotine fix. That was the power of addiction, and he knew it would likely kill him. He tried nicotine gum and patches, hypnosis and acupuncture, but nothing helped. At 74, Steve's habit finally caught up with him in the form of advanced COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. He could no longer walk more than a block, needed portable oxygen, along with prednisone, inhalers, and antibiotics. Every few months, he wound up in our ER. His wife, Dorothy, was a strong-willed woman, and utterly beside herself because of his continued smoking. Exhausted after years of nagging, she began heading off on trips of her own just to clear her head. But she dearly loved her husband and always accompanied him on office visits and was willing to be his strong advocate. After several hospitalizations, Steve was preparing for the end. He let me know that he did not ever want to be put on life support or have CPR. He had discussed these wishes with Dorothy, and though she did not necessarily agree with his plans of not going on a ventilator ever, she promised to honor them as Steve's designated healthcare agent. Whatever he wants, I'll support him, Dorothy said. The problem arose when Steve was admitted to the hospital once again, and I was out of town. A young colleague of mine, an excellent pulmonologist, evaluated him, and a conversation did not go well. Your breathing problem is critical. I'd like to move you to the ICU, my colleague said. No, Steve whispered, I'm not going there. I don't want a ventilator. Well, why not? Look, just treat my shortness of breath and make me comfortable, Steve gasped. Then Dorothy took the reins. Dr. Steve does really not want to go on life support. We've talked about it many times. The doctor said, well, I think you should both rethink that. With a ventilator, we could save his life. The back and forth continued, with my colleague pushing for the ICU until Dorothy had finally had enough. Doctor, you aren't listening, she said. Please leave. Steve's wife had all the qualities we want in an advocate. She was a good listener, unafraid to stand up for her husband's rights, and undaunted in her support for Steve's wishes, even though they may not have been her own. I wish he hadn't had to push so hard, but sometimes that's what it takes. And Steve died a few days later. When families and medical caregivers can't arrive on a plan through shared decision-making, it usually means someone isn't listening. Fortunately, Steve had Dorothy to speak for him until the end. Actually, I heard from the nurses later that she all but threw my colleague out of the room. Later, he and I spoke about the confrontation. As a young doctor, he hadn't quite come to the point where he was comfortable in letting go. I walked him through the idea of respecting patients' autonomy, even when we might want to push on. I think he listened. So this is just one example of the kind of person that you want to have. And each state has its own law. For example, if you've not filled out the proper form for designating a healthcare proxy or durable power of attorney for healthcare, then state law generally will state who has that power. And in the state of Washington, for example, it goes to your spouse or designated healthcare agent or guardian. Then if none is available, it would go to your adult children. The problem in the state of Washington is all of your children have to agree. So we generally recommend that you try to appoint just one with some alternates, or if you appoint more than one, that you make sure that they agree, because if the kids are disagree, then we have no clear plan in place, and the default is usually to do everything. So that's a very important point. And then after that, it might go to parents or other relatives, or sometimes if there's nobody available and nobody appointed, doctors just have to do their best until there can be a court-appointed guardian. So I think I listed some of the qualities that you want that person to have, but I think number one is to be a good listener and to be able to really understand your heart and what your wishes are, and to be a fairly strong person, not afraid to tell other family members that, yeah, I know these are your wishes, but your dad's wishes were these, and this is my job is to carry that out. So sometimes it means being a very strong advocate and disagreeing with others. For example, my father at the end did not want any intervention. He was in a nursing home in a coma, basically. And I had one relative saying, well, you're just going to take these old people out there and let them die. And I said, well, Dad's wishes were not to have fluids, not to have nutrition, and to just get care for comfort. So I had to tell the relatives we were not going to use intravenous fluids or that something like a tube feeding. Dad was 94, and it was time to let go. He wasn't particularly happy, this particular relative, but I think he did respect that Dad had expressed his wishes. He couldn't express them anymore. So the durable power of attorney, which was myself and my sister at that point, we had to pretty forcefully say what Dad's wishes were so that, you know, he had the kind of ending that he wanted. So one other quick suggestion I have, if you are somebody health care's agent, if you can sit with a person as they're completing their advance directive, and most advance directives have a number of value statements about what matters most to the individual and what quality of life they're really looking for. If you can sit with them and have an interactive conversation as they are completing their advance directive or updating it, and as you're signing that form, or I'm sorry, they are signing the form appointing you and someone as witness, if that can all occur while you're there, so you really can see the impact and importance of being that, not only a durable power of attorney healthcare proxy, but you're also a primary caregiver for that person as they're making those serious decisions. So I'll leave it open at that, Michael, and maybe people hopefully are coming up with some questions.
Yeah, there's some questions coming in. So if those of you who are tuned in, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen for questions for Jim. And this can be about healthcare proxies, healthcare agents, but also it could be about something else entirely around the topic of end-of-life planning. And so Jim, there's a fair number of terms here. And I think it can be a little bit confusing for people. There's a durable power of attorney, a healthcare proxy, a healthcare agent, and a health advocate. And they pretty much are indicating the same thing, correct?
Right. If you're an advocate, it's probably the broadest term, but to make that a reality, in a legal sense, the form should be signed appointing you to be that advocate for their care when they can't care for themselves. And I should point out, in the last 2 weeks of our lives, about half of us are unable to speak for ourselves. So that advocacy is very important. So when you sign the document, it'll say durable power of attorney for healthcare. And easier, it's a big mouthful. So I think we often use the shortcut saying healthcare proxy or durable power of attorney for healthcare, or even the broader term advocate.
Right. And it's important, I think, to have, I mean, really, I would say essential to have determined who this person's going to be and have a legally binding document, either in your advanced care directive or separate from, that identifies the person. But that's not to say that we shouldn't have lots of advocates. We shouldn't have lots of allies. And the more people that we communicate our wishes to, the more likely it is that they're going to get honored in a difficult situation, or just even a regular situation at the end of life. So there's, you want to overly burden when you say just that one person, though we do want to make sure they clearly understand.
Yeah, on most forms, there is a place to put alternates, number 2, number 3. I think it's a very important point, though, that you want to bring your closest friends and family into that circle so that they really understand what your wishes are, particularly if you have time to do that. And I had one lady, she filled out all her forms, made copies of everything, mailed it to all her family and closest friends, and then called a meeting. And this would be like, let's have dinner and talk about death. You bring them in a situation where you're in a comfortable space, there's not a crisis going on, and you can share some food or wine or whatever, and then talk about what your wishes are. And this particular individual, her children were all fairly strong-willed, as many of our children are. And she went around the room after the discussion and just pointedly said, do you agree? Do you agree? Do you agree? Because the last thing she wanted was a fighting family around the bedside. And when we would see that kind of dysfunctional family, there was often, a lot of history there of unresolved issues in the family, or perhaps somebody that was estranged from the family, that would call in at the last minute, maybe an alcoholic saying, don't you dare take my father off the respirator. I'm going to be there in 2 days. I want you to keep him going, and I'll sue you if you don't, that kind of thing. So as much as you can bring that family, even the ones that are on the periphery, because the ones that are on the periphery and don't feel included are very likely to feel left out and angry and can become obstructive.
Yeah, and I would say there's the more evident conflict that happens when you say there's a lot of familial dysfunction or a lack of communication. But I would say even more subtly, for families that aren't so outward in their conflict around care at the end, or funeral planning, or what happens to one's body, or how do we memorialize or honor a loved one. There's a lot of subtle pain and conflict that happens that doesn't get expressed often if these conversations aren't had.
Yeah, I think the more complete you can be. I had one lady that not only addressed those questions, but she put in her directive what china, what crystal, what songs and poems she wanted to set around the dining room table, and what toast should be made to wish her well in their journey to God, as she put it. So I think that certain personalities will do that. Certain personalities will say, I'm just going to leave it up to the family. But whatever works for your family and what you think might work for your loved ones. But having those conversations and communicating that is a barrier. And I'm sure, Michael, in your book and in your talking around the dinner table, I think those questions can come up, and you find a safe spot to do that for sure.
Yeah, well, and the nice thing about Endurable power of attorneys is this is something that we can do reasonably well before anybody has any kind of condition, chronic or otherwise. It makes sense for all of us to have a healthcare proxy and to have a conversation with that person. So there's not as much pressure as on this conversation as there is maybe with other death conversations. It's like it just makes sense to have a buddy who knows what you want, regardless of whether, like, I'm going rafting next week. Well, good. Make sure that my healthcare proxy, paperwork is current, and so we can take a little bit of pressure off, I think, and just make it very clear that this is something that everyone should have. And you're not really talking about death, and you're not really talking about your own illness or future or otherwise. You're just having a very rational conversation about how you'd want to be taken care of in the eventuality that you don't have the ability to advocate for yourself.
Yeah, I had one. Sometimes the proxy can be put in a difficult situation because something might come up that you didn't expect. And I was giving a talk at one group where it was important to respect the wishes and understand the wishes of the person where you're the proxy for. But her husband had signed papers basically that he really wanted everything done. He was, I think, in that subgroup you would call a vitalist, at least, but she didn't think he thought it through. He said he would want everything done, but he developed Alzheimer's, and he got to the point where he had to be moved to a memory care unit, and he was declared incompetent for financial or healthcare decision reasons. And his wife was saying he had signed these papers, but she didn't really know if he really still wanted what he said he wanted at the time. And she was in a quandary, and I said, well, do you think CPR and putting him on a ventilator or giving him tube feeding would benefit him? She said, no, but I don't really know what he wants. And I said, well, have you talked to your doctor or your pastor or whoever is your spiritual leader? And she said, yes, but I still am uncomfortable. And I said, well, there are times when a healthcare proxy has to do what they think will be in the best interest of the person they're taking care of. And he's basically a different person now as he's gone into this state of dementia. And so in a way you have to shift gears and begin to think of him as this different person. She walked out, still kind of scratching her head, being unsure of what she wanted to do. But I talked to a healthcare lawyer after that saying, well, what right does the proxy have to actually change what's written in that advance directive? And she said, well, sometimes you just need to do the best you can. You can't necessarily follow the letter of the law because sometimes that really is not in the best interest for everybody. She said you could get sued if you don't, I suppose, but or maybe you could get sued if you did. So I think sometimes it comes down to goodwill and common sense and just trying to do the best thing. But it put her in a very difficult situation because of what her husband had said.
Yeah, and we'll be doing an EOL 101 session with our mutual friend Barack Gaster, who's the Dementia Directive, looking specifically at early onset, but also full-blown Alzheimer's and dementia.
Right.
It's very particular type of advanced care planning that so many of us face, will face, impact our family. Another thing is sometimes there's not the right family member to indicate or friend to indicate as a healthcare proxy, and you can hire a healthcare proxy. You want to talk about that really briefly, and then we'll get into our expert question asker. A couple for you today.
Okay. Yeah, there are some organizations in Washington. The organization used to be called WASHA, Washington State Healthcare Advocacy Association. It's a group of people, generally retired nurses or healthcare workers, or scientists, social workers, that will become your healthcare proxy for a fee. It's basically a fee-based service for people that just do not have an advocate. There's a broader organization called Advocates it's spelled advocate with an X on the end, that is more nationwide. And I think people in various states can look up to see if there are pro bono advocates that they can connect with if they can't find one for themselves. But it is a difficult situation. There are people, and I've run into people in the classes I've given, that say they just don't have anybody. And that's always a little bit sad when you find that, but it is true. And we all do need to find somebody for sure.
Yeah, and sometimes it makes sense to have that person be outside of family and friends. Who's
you don't have to choose your spouse or even your crazy child. I mean, you need to find the right qualities in the person, and it can be a trusted friend, maybe a nurse friend or a social worker friend, or somebody that is comfortable in that uncomfortable healthcare arena. Robin Shapiro, who heads up the group here in Seattle, has written a book called The Secret Language of Healthcare. And it is like moving into a different universe with a lot of terms and bells and whistles and machinery and noises and technology that make us very uncomfortable and will shut down some people. So it's got to be a person that is kind of comfortable in that arena to be able to deal with all that.
Definitely. And so we've got a question from Bob. And Bob asks, in such a situation like Steve's, can you just leave the hospital on your own with your family agreement and help without the doctor permission against medical advice?
Yeah, you can always leave the hospital. You always have the right. You aren't in jail. So you can sign out what they call AMA, against medical advice. And I've seen people leave the ICU that were recovering and just couldn't take it anymore and go out with an IV bottle running and hail a taxi cab. I mean, there are some really wild things that occur. And I think sometimes for a dying patient, the hospital might want to keep them there, but the family really wants to have them home. And there may be a tug of war, but yes, you do have the right to leave the hospital.
Great. And then one, this is a big question, but we'll try to keep it brief because you have a video to show us too. Also from Bob, can you talk about any experience or the pros and cons of a home death?
Well, I think that's where most people would want to die, would be at home. When people are pulled, they almost say, I want to be at home surrounded by my loved ones. And that's ideal. And this occurs a lot in nursing homes. So they will create as much of a home type environment for the individual, have family and loved ones with them, pictures, music, other things, so that you can die in a more peaceful way. I mean, one of the more tragic things that's happened during COVID has been the hospital deaths where nobody could be with them, or you could only be with them electronically. And so, yeah, of course, with home death, ideally you'd have hospice there supporting you and the palliative care needs met, your spiritual needs met, other physical needs met, but it can be arranged. You hate to arrange it in a hasty manner, such as an urgent discharge from a hospital. You like to have time to let it evolve, and it's much more peaceful and structured that way.
And I think that we're getting better and better at servicing families that do decide to have a loved one die at home.
Yeah.
A real gap in services that is beginning to be filled.
Yeah, prior, I practiced medicine prior to hospice, and when I would send somebody home, they might say, well, the visiting nurse will be around periodically, but they didn't have a 24/7 phone number. They didn't have the level of support, medical equipment, and other things that is offered under hospice now.
So Bob also shared about his 75th birthday celebration last week, where he brought all of his family to his future cemetery plot, and then he showed them and shared his advanced directives with them.
Okay. Yeah, that's whatever works for you and your particular family. That's terrific.
And I think you had a video. We're gonna leave you all today with a video from the Conversation Project that Jim's gonna share, and we'll be back next week.
Yeah, this video is from the Conversation Project, and it's kind of how to, or maybe how not to choose your healthcare proxy. So here we go.
All right.
Be your healthcare proxy? Like if you need someone to tell the doctor what to? I just go with whatever the doctors say. I wouldn't want to bother them. They're so busy. Doctors know best, right?
Be your healthcare proxy? Sure, I'd be happy to. If I'm in town, check out my Instagram pics from Peru. Wish you were here.
Oh, I could never let you go. I can't even throw a plant away. As long as it's got one little green leaf. I'd be like, can't we upload her to the cloud?
Well, heck yeah. I've given this a lot of thought. Let me tell you what decisions you're best off going with. You never let them resuscitate you. And if they even try to hook you up to one of those breathing machines, never. I got this. I totally got this.
How can you even talk about this? I can't, okay? I just can't. Mom, it's not like you're gonna die. No, I can't talk right now.
Oh wait, did I show you that meme from iFunny? The cat and the dishwasher? Oh my gosh, okay. So the cat's like, bleh. And then he's like, wah! Oh wait, sorry, what?
Well, hon, you and I have been through so much together. Here's what we'll do. We'll sit down, we'll get a cup of coffee, and you tell me what matters to you.
Well, it wouldn't be easy. I mean, I'd be sad, but I'd have your back.
I remember when we went through this with Mom, we really spoke for her. So I think I can do that for you. Let's talk about what you would want.
That was great.
Cute.
And we'll share it right now in the chat. The Conversation Project is a great resource for choosing a healthcare proxy. And with that, I'm going to let Jessica, our producer, take it away with a little music. And Jim, thanks once again. We'll see you next week.
Okay. See you next week, Michael. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.